The number of countries that contributed to the war in Afghanistan is nearly 4 dozen, and a similar number fought in the Iraq War. Countries that fought in both conflicts include the United Kingdom, Australia, and Italy, but a notable nation is Georgia, a former Soviet republic of 3.7 million people on Russia's southern border in the Caucasus. Despite its small size, Georgia's commitment was not a token one. Its troop deployments were significant when adjusted for population, and it lost nearly 40 soldiers across both wars. At first glance, it might seem odd that a country like Georgia would fight in two American-led wars, but its rationale becomes clearer in the context of Georgia's desire to join one of the world's most prominent military alliances, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Founded in 1949 as a means to resist communism in the Soviet Union, NATO originally consisted of 12 countries in North America and Western Europe. The alliance expanded incrementally throughout the Cold War to include Turkey, Greece, Germany, and Spain, but the past 3 decades have seen 14 new members join, including 10 former members of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union's collective defense organization created in response to the formation of NATO. 3 of NATO's current members, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, are former Soviet republics. The main principle of NATO is collective defense, in which the alliance deems an attack on one member to be an attack on all members. With unanimous agreement, the alliance can invoke Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty and respond to an attack on a member state that occurs north of the Tropic of Cancer with measures that include military force. For European nations, NATO was attractive because they could not resist the Soviet Union alone and could be picked off one by one if the USSR attacked. With collective defense, going to war with one NATO member could have meant going to war with all NATO members, so the USSR never attacked a NATO country. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the countries that joined NATO saw it as a mechanism to maintain their newfound sovereignty and freedom, 2 things they lacked under Soviet control. NATO's expansion since the end of the Cold War has caused tension with Russia, however, because the new members are closer geographically to Russia. NATO has always had a border with the USSR and Russia via Norway, but expanded in 1952 with Turkey and 1999 with the admission of Poland, which shares a border with the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. In 2004, the Russia-NATO border expanded again with the addition of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, this time much closer to Moscow and St. Petersburg. NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe is inherently complicated. On one hand, Russia sees the region as part of its historical sphere of influence and views NATO as a threat to its security. On the other, most Eastern European countries view their proximity to Russia as a national security threat. The Soviets inflicted numerous horrors in the region, including a 1930s genocide of millions of Ukrainians by depriving them of food, and severe crackdowns on pro-democracy campaigns in Hungary and Czechoslovakia in 1956 and 1968, respectively. Given the history, it is not surprising that Eastern European countries seek the protection of the United States instead of Russia, the successor to the state that oppressed them. In contrast, NATO expansion to include, say, Ireland or Switzerland would not draw as much objection from Russia. But those 2 countries do not need NATO protection like Eastern European countries do. A rule of thumb for NATO expansion is the more a particular country views Russia as a threat, the greater objection Russia will have to that country joining NATO. A significant risk with NATO expansion is that it creates new flashpoints where conflict between Russia and NATO can emerge. Contrary to what one might expect, even if NATO invokes Article 5 in response to a Russian armed attack on a NATO country, that does not necessarily mean NATO will reciprocate with armed force. NATO's treaty is based on Article 51 of the UN Charter, which establishes the right of countries to defend themselves against armed attack. NATO uses Article 51 as the basis to respond collectively to an attack on an ally, but a response could mean military force, weapon shipments, sanctions, or even just a diplomatic protest. Article 11 of the NATO uses language making clear each country's participation in NATO is subject to their constitutional processes, and in the US, only Congress can declare war. As NATO's physical footprint grows, there will be more places in the alliance Russia potentially could move against. If Russia attacked a NATO country like it did Ukraine in February 2022, a military response would be likely. But what if Russia makes a limited territorial land grab, say part of a Baltic state or Sweden's Gotland Island? NATO could be in a serious bind. Responding in kind militarily would likely spiral into full-scale war, but responding in a limited manner with measures like sanctions could undermine the alliance's credibility. Again, NATO's default response to Russian aggression is not military force, but involves a range of possible actions. NATO countries are democracies, and their legislatures and populations would be hesitant to allow a relatively small Russian aggression to devolve into full-scale war. Shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Germany reunified, and so it was an open question as to whether NATO would expand to include the former territory of East Germany. Negotiations between the United States, Soviet Union, the UK, and France resulted in the 2+4 Treaty, allowing all of unified Germany to be a part of NATO and prohibiting the deployment of any foreign troops in the territory of former East Germany. But the treaty did not address further NATO expansion at all. However, the Russian government has claimed repeatedly since that NATO expansion was discussed during negotiations, and the US actually agreed not to expand NATO at all. During a 1990 meeting with Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, then Secretary of State James Baker initially floated the idea of barring NATO expansion eastward. The US National Security Council quickly dismissed that proposal, and it was not discussed with the Soviets again, nor included in the treaty. The Russian government has cited this so-called handshake agreement not to expand NATO numerous times, but its actual validity is not serious. Even if James Baker, with then President George H.W. Bush's approval, had told the Soviets that NATO expansion eastward was never going to happen, this hypothetical agreement would not have survived to the next president. Under the Constitution, only treaties ratified by a 2/3 vote in the Senate are legally binding regardless of who the president is, so long as the US remains in the treaty. Presidents can sign executive agreements with other countries without Senate approval, but such an agreement can be revoked by a future president. A US Secretary of State does not have the authority to make a promise to a foreign country that lasts decades, and the Russians know this. Even Mikhail Gorbachev said the Americans did not make any promises about NATO expansion, but later did say the admission of new NATO members in the 1990s and 2000s violated the spirit of the 2+4 Treaty. There are now 30 members of NATO, and Sweden and Finland are set to end their long-standing policies of neutrality and join the alliance because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. NATO's border with Russia will expand by over 800 miles, and the strategic picture for NATO is poised to shift in its favor. Currently, NATO's biggest geographic vulnerability is the Baltic states. They are sandwiched between the Baltic Sea to the west and Russia and its ally Belarus to the east. To the south, all that connects the Baltics to Poland and the rest of NATO is the 60-mile Suwalki Gap. In a war, it is conceivable that Russia could surround the Baltic states by attacking via Belarus in its Kaliningrad enclave. While Sweden and Finland will not change the dynamics on land, most of the Baltic Sea will now be lined with NATO countries, improving NATO's chances of staying connected to the Baltic states by sea in the event they are cut off on land. Russia's reaction to Sweden and Finland's NATO applications was muted, as both countries already field powerful militaries to protect their neutrality, so by itself, Sweden and Finland in NATO does not radically change the balance of power between Scandinavia and Russia. Russia's reaction is quite different, however, when it comes to the possibility of two of its neighbors, Ukraine and Georgia, joining NATO. Both former Soviet republics, Georgia and Ukraine have sought NATO membership since the 2000s. The problem for both is that Russia considers each of them joining NATO to be an absolute red line, partly because each are located on major land corridors where Russia is vulnerable to invasion. Almost all of Ukraine is relatively flat, but it serves as a barrier insulating Russia from most of NATO. If Ukraine joined NATO, not only would Russia lose this buffer, but its ally Belarus would be highly vulnerable because NATO countries would be situated on both of Belarus's flanks. With Georgia, its coastline on the Black Sea west of the Caucasus Mountains could provide another land corridor that NATO could exploit in the event of war. The reality for both countries is that they are among the most vulnerable countries to Russian aggression, but each have little chance of joining NATO. Georgia was invaded by Russia in 2008, and Ukraine was attacked in 2014 and 2022, confirming their fears of Russian aggression. Now that Russia is actively fighting a war in Ukraine, admitting Ukraine into NATO would draw the alliance into the war because Ukraine could immediately invoke Article 5. Despite Georgia's gestures of goodwill that include participating in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, admitting Georgia into NATO is also a non-starter because the Russian-backed governments of Abkhazia and South Ossetia currently occupy 20% of Georgia's territory. Russia's objections to Sweden and Finland joining NATO might be milder than Ukraine and Georgia's attempts, but one thing it universally opposes is the deployment of NATO forces further and further eastward, closer to its territory. When a country joins NATO, it must have a military advanced enough to be acceptable to the alliance, but Eastern European countries still have quantitatively smaller militaries than Russia, a key reason they joined NATO in the first place. Admission into NATO provides defensive protection for the members, but on its own, joining NATO does not significantly change how a country like Estonia matches up against Russia militarily. What does change the strategic picture from Russia's perspective is the deployment of new NATO troops into new member countries. Currently, there are approximately 100,000 American troops stationed in Europe, but most are in Western Europe. The United States has permanent bases with thousands of troops in the UK, Germany, Italy, and Spain. But in Eastern Europe, many American troops are deployed on a rotational basis, meaning units rotate in and out and stay on bases belonging to the host country. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, not only have these rotational deployments increased, the US military established a permanent base in Poland and is considering additional permanent bases, moves that would change the balance of power with Russia in the region. As NATO continues expanding, with countries including Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, and Moldova having various degrees of interest, new external pressures could be placed on the alliance along with internal ones too. There must be unanimous support among existing members to admit a new country, so just one can hold up the admission process as a means of extracting concessions. This is exactly what Turkey is currently doing with Sweden and Finland. In exchange for Turkey's vote to admit both countries, it initially demanded new counterterrorism actions be taken against Kurdish groups in those countries, and even the extradition of a Swedish member of parliament. Turkey watered down its demands in a final agreement between the three countries, but its actions show a serious risk for countries seeking to join NATO. By applying to join a military alliance, a country is by definition dropping all pretenses of neutrality. If an Eastern European country tries to join NATO but is rejected, It would be in the lose-lose situation of not gaining military protection while also damaging its relations with Russia. Kosovo, a country with limited international recognition that declared independence from Serbia in 2008, may apply to join NATO in the future. Its bid would not be guaranteed, however, because it would need Spain's support. Spain's national government has been resisting attempts by its northeastern Catalonia region to gain independence, so it is sensitive about legitimizing a country like Kosovo because Serbia did not agree to Kosovo becoming independent. Another complication with NATO expansion is the potential for conflict between members. Despite being broadly united in opposition to Russia, disputes can rise on occasion, and some members have long-standing differences. The most notable example is maritime disputes between Greece and Turkey in the Aegean Sea. The conflict stems from Greece controlling most of the islands in the Aegean and consequently claiming significant portions of the body of water as its territorial waters and exclusive economic zone. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, a country can claim up to 12 nautical miles offshore as territorial waters and up to 200 nautical miles offshore as its exclusive economic zone where it has rights to all underwater resources. Today, both Greece and Turkey only claim 6 nautical miles of coastal waters in the Aegean as territorial, and Greece is a state party to the UNCLOS, while Turkey is not. The Turkish government has said that any attempt by Greece to establish 12 nautical mile territorial waters in the Aegean would constitute an act of war. For the EEZ, the crux of the dispute is that Turkey wants to split the Aegean in half, meaning some Greek islands would be entirely within Turkey's EEZ. Greece wants to claim an EEZ around all of its islands, effectively putting most of the Aegean in the Greek zone. Out in the eastern Mediterranean, Greece and Turkey also have EEZ disputes, made more complicated by the discovery of significant natural gas deposits in the area. The two countries also disagree about airspace rights and the presence of military forces on some Greek islands. If the disputes between Greece and Turkey ever escalated into military conflict, NATO could face serious challenges. If a skirmish between the two sides launched a broader conflict and both countries invoked Article 5, NATO could be unable to respond since Article 5 needs unanimous agreement, and presumably both Greece and Turkey would reject the other's requests for assistance. Even if one side was the clear aggressor, the North Atlantic Treaty does not have a provision for removing a member, although the NAT requires all members to abide by the UN Charter, which prohibits wars of aggression. For European countries, membership in NATO has been a means to protect their territories from Russian expansionism. After the Cold War ended, there were doubts about NATO's future, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine has given new purpose to the alliance. It now counts 27 of the 44 countries in Europe as members, and could see several countries join in the coming years. The fact remains, though, that because of Russia's fierce objections, NATO membership for countries like Georgia and Ukraine that need it most will for the foreseeable future be, as Ukrainian President Zelensky put it, a dream.